It was supposed to be an ordinary trip, a getaway from the stress of work, an escape to somewhere peaceful. But for Sarah and Mark, two travelers looking for some rest in the famous Graycrest Hotel, what they would experience would turn their world upside down. Located in a remote part of the country, Graycrest Hotel had always been known for its antique charm, its breathtaking views, and the old-world luxury it provided to its guests. But hidden beneath the surface was a dark, twisted history that no one had dared to reveal. As they drove down the narrow, fog-covered road leading to the hotel, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Her instincts screamed to turn back, but Mark, ever the adventurer, brushed her fears aside. "It's just a spooky legend," he said with a chuckle. But deep inside, Sarah knew, sometimes legends are born from truths too horrifying to face. When they first entered the hotel, everything appeared to be perfect. The lobby was grand and immaculate, with vintage chandeliers casting a warm glow over the polished floors. But as the front desk clerk handed them their keys, his eyes flickered with something unsettling. He didn't speak a word. His gaze lingered just a little too long, and Sarah felt a chill race down her spine. But again, she brushed it off. After all, what could go wrong? Their room was located on the third floor, a corridor dimly lit by sconces on the walls. As they stepped inside, the air felt thick, as if something unseen was watching them. The view from the window was breathtaking, but Sarah couldn't shake the unease that clung to the air. As she unpacked, Mark began to explore the room. He found a strange old mirror placed against one of the walls, a mirror with an intricate Gothic frame. Its surface was cracked, and a thin layer of dust clung to it. He wiped it off, admiring its beauty. But as he looked into the mirror, his reflection didn't quite match his movements. It seemed to shift, flicker, and even smile back at him with an eerie grin. "Sarah," Mark called, voice trembling. "You need to see this." Sarah turned, her heart racing. She glanced into the mirror, only to find her own reflection staring back at her with a twisted, unnatural expression. The face that looked back at her was not her own. It was distorted, eyes wide and full of fear. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and a faint whisper filled the air. "Leave! Now!" The voice echoed, barely audible, but enough to send terror coursing through her veins. They tried to leave, but as they turned toward the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. Mark rushed to the window, but it wouldn't budge. The glass was cold, almost unnaturally so. Fear had a grip on their hearts, and they were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. As Sarah turned back toward the room, she caught a glimpse of the mirror again. This time, it wasn't showing them at all. Instead, it displayed a ghostly figure, a woman dressed in a tattered gown, her face obscured by long, matted hair. The woman reached out of the mirror, her hand stretching impossibly far, and brushed Sarah's cheek. Her touch was ice cold, like death itself. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she backed away, horrified by the unearthly presence that was taking over the room. Mark, paralyzed with fear, grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the door. But just as they reached the handle, a loud crash came from the corner of the room. The door behind them slammed open with a violent force, and a cold wind swept through, extinguishing the candles on the walls. As the wind howled through the hotel, the figure in the mirror grew more defined. Her features became clear. She had once been beautiful, but her face was now twisted in agony. Blood dripped from her mouth, and her eyes were hollow, filled with darkness. The woman let out a guttural scream, and the mirror cracked further, splintering into countless pieces. In that moment, Sarah remembered the story of the Graycrest Hotel, the very one that no one dared to tell. Years ago, a young bride had checked into the hotel for her honeymoon. Her husband, a man filled with greed, had left her alone in the room while he spent the night gambling. Overcome with loneliness and despair, the bride had hung herself in front of the mirror, her body swinging as the hotel's walls absorbed her grief. Her spirit, however, could never rest, and now she roamed the halls of Graycrest Hotel, searching for others to share her torment. The mirror was her prison, and Sarah and Mark had unknowingly stepped into it. The ghostly figure of the bride was trying to pull them in, to claim them as her own. The hotel's very foundations seemed to shift as the air thickened with malevolent energy. The door, which they had thought to be their escape, had sealed itself shut, leaving them with no way out. Just when Sarah thought they would perish in that accursed room, Mark, desperate and wide-eyed, recalled a key detail, something that could set them free. The key was hidden deep within the legend of the Graycrest Hotel. They needed to perform a ritual of forgiveness to release the trapped spirit and break the curse that had bound the hotel for so long. But the question remained, could they escape the vengeful ghost's grip before it was too late? As the darkness closed in, Sarah reached for the locket around her neck, which had once belonged to her grandmother. It was an heirloom that had been passed down through generations. Inside the locket was a strange engraving that Mark now realized might be the key to breaking the curse. But before they could even act on it, a loud crash echoed from the other side of the door. The bride's ghost had found them, and this time, it was too late to turn back. The screen fades to black, leaving Sarah and Mark's fate hanging in the balance. What happens next? Will they escape the hotel's terrifying grasp? The next episode promises even more revelations and spine-chilling twists as the true nature of the Graycrest Hotel's curse is finally revealed. Sometimes a place is so steeped in pain and loss that it becomes more than just a building. It becomes a vessel for the very souls it holds within. When Mark and Sarah entered the Graycrest Hotel, they had no idea that they were stepping into a nightmare that would unfold before their very eyes, where every step would be their last. As they stood in the hotel's chilling, dimly lit lobby, the grand chandelier overhead swayed gently, creaking as if it too were haunted by 1,000 memories. The air felt heavy, thick with a sense of foreboding. The old hotel had a way of making one feel small, insignificant, as though the walls knew more than they should. As Mark pushed open the ancient door to their room, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. Before they entered their hotel room, Sarah glanced at Mark with a worried look. She had heard whispers about this place, the stories that everyone at the front desk avoided mentioning, the rumors of the bride's curse that had plagued the hotel for years. But Mark, ever the skeptic, laughed it off. "It's just stories, Sarah," he said. "Just old folklore." But Sarah's mind kept racing. It wasn't just stories. She felt the energy of the place gnawing at her, whispering in her ears. She remembered her mother's voice telling her to stay away from places with too much history, too much grief. Now standing on the threshold of room 307, Sarah felt the weight of 100 souls pressing down on her heart. Little did she know, she was about to join those souls in torment. They entered the room. It was like stepping back in time, a relic from another era, but strangely preserved. The furniture was old but polished, the wallpaper faded with age, and yet there was something deeply unsettling about the room. Sarah noticed the large, antique mirror hanging over the bed, its surface cracked and cloudy. She looked at it briefly but quickly turned away. But Mark, curious as ever, approached the mirror. As he wiped off a layer of dust, the room grew colder. The temperature plummeted in an instant, the air turning icy. Sarah shivered as she watched Mark's reflection in the glass, a reflection that wasn't his own. It was distorted. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and staring back at him, not in his control but full of terror. Before Sarah could say anything, the mirror's surface rippled as if it were made of water. The reflection in the mirror wasn't Mark anymore. It was a pale, ghostly figure, a woman in a tattered wedding dress, her hair hanging in tangled, greasy strands. Suddenly, the mirror cracked, and a deep, guttural voice emanated from it. "Get out! Now!" it screamed, sending a shockwave of fear through both Sarah and Mark. The mirror shattered completely, but that was only the beginning of their nightmare. The room began to shake, the walls creaking, as though the building itself was alive. Desperately, Mark and Sarah tried to run, but the door wouldn't open. It had sealed shut as though the hotel itself had decided they weren't allowed to leave. The temperature dropped even further, and the once beautiful chandelier began to flicker violently. As they backed away from the door, Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. The ghostly bride, now fully visible, appeared before them, her face twisted in anguish. Her eyes were empty, her mouth wide open in a silent scream, as if begging them to understand. Her hands reached toward Sarah, her touch cold as ice, freezing her to the spot. Mark, trying to pull her away, suddenly stumbled and fell. When he looked up, he saw that the bride's face had changed. Her features had melted into something more horrifying. Her mouth was dripping with black blood, her eyes wide open in rage. "Why didn't you help me?" the ghost moaned in a voice that seemed to come from all around them. "Why didn't you save me?" Sarah's heart shattered. She could feel the ghost's pain, the grief, the betrayal, the loneliness. She realized with horror that this bride had been abandoned, left to die alone, with no one to help her in her darkest moment. Now she was cursed to wander, seeking those who could understand her pain. The ghost's mournful cry filled the room, and with a flash, Sarah and Mark were thrown back against the wall. Tears rolled down Sarah's face as she cried for the woman who had died in despair. But at that moment, she understood. This hotel wasn't just haunted. It was a prison for the lost, for the forgotten, for souls that had been abandoned in their final moments. And now Sarah and Mark were caught in the same fate. The hotel seemed to respond to their fear. The very walls began to pulse, as though the building was alive, feeding on their terror. Mark scrambled to his feet, but as he looked around, the bride's apparition was nowhere to be seen. Instead, they found themselves standing in the same room, but the decor had changed. The bed was now covered in an old blood-stained wedding dress, and the mirror on the wall showed the reflection of a different couple, standing in the same room, dressed in period clothing. They smiled at Sarah and Mark, but their eyes were empty, lifeless. As Mark stepped closer to the mirror, the couple in the reflection turned and walked toward him, their movements jerky and unnatural. In a voice that didn't belong to them, they whispered, "You are not supposed to be here." Suddenly, the reflection shattered once again, but this time, the room was completely silent. Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. A cold wind whispered through the room, and in that moment, she understood. The curse of Graycrest Hotel wasn't just a story, it was real. The spirits trapped within its walls could never leave, and they would never let anyone else leave either. Just when Sarah thought they were lost, an old man appeared in the doorway, his face wrinkled and his clothes tattered. His eyes were full of grief, and when he spoke, his voice cracked. "You must leave before it's too late," he warned them. "There's a way out, but the cost is greater than you can imagine." He pointed toward the mirror, which was now whole again. "There's one key to breaking the curse, but once you take it, you will never be the same." Before they could ask any questions, the man disappeared, leaving only the haunting silence behind. The mirror flickered again, but this time something moved, something far more sinister. The walls of Graycrest Hotel trembled once again, but this time the air wasn't filled with the same suffocating dread. It was as if the hotel had paused, holding its breath, waiting for Sarah and Mark to make a choice. The feeling was overwhelming, as if the very building itself was alive, watching them with 1,000 eyes. They had experienced unimaginable horrors, but now standing at the crossroads of their fear and survival, they had one chance left, a miracle waiting to be claimed. The ghostly figure of the bride had vanished, and yet her mournful wail still echoed in their minds, leaving them restless. The terrifying reflection in the mirror, the cursed wedding dress, and the voices that had tormented them. Everything had led them to this moment. This moment when Sarah and Mark could either fall into despair or find a way to break the curse that had bound them to the hotel. With trembling hands, Sarah grasped the pendant she had found in the ruins of the old hotel. The pendant, which had once belonged to the bride who had died in pain and sorrow, felt strangely warm against her skin. Could it really be the key to breaking the curse? Was there a miracle in it for them? Or would they too be forever trapped in the hotel's endless nightmare? Mark looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Sarah, we've seen the worst of this place, but I can't help but feel that there's something more to this hotel, something we're missing." He glanced at the shattered mirror, where the ghostly figures of the couple had once stood, warning them. "I think the only way out is to face what we've been avoiding, her." Sarah's heart raced. The words stung, but she knew they were true. The bride's spirit had been seeking something, and they were the ones she had chosen to show the truth to. With Mark's words hanging in the air, Sarah reached for the pendant. It was cold at first, but as soon as she held it tightly in her palm, a wave of warmth surged through her. The temperature in the room began to rise, and the walls that had once seemed so alive now seemed to soften. The hotel was not as it appeared. It was as if the spirits within had gathered, waiting for this moment, as though they had all been holding their breath, anticipating the power that the pendant held. As Sarah stood there, the mirror before them began to shimmer once more, and within the reflective glass, the bride appeared. Not as the terrifying specter, but as a woman, alive, beautiful, and full of sorrow. Her eyes met Sarah's, and for the first time, Sarah didn't feel afraid. She felt compassion. "You have found the key," the bride whispered softly, her voice like a gentle breeze. "But it comes at a cost." The bride's words echoed, and suddenly, Sarah realized the price they would have to pay. The souls trapped in this hotel had been waiting for redemption, for release, and the only way to free them was to give up the one thing that had kept them connected to this world: their past, their memories. If Sarah and Mark truly wished to leave, they would have to let go of everything they had ever known, everything they had loved. The curse would lift, but only if they released the ties that bound them. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "But what about us? If we give everything up, we'll have nothing left," she whispered, her voice shaking. Mark reached for her hand, but he too was stricken by the weight of what they had to do. As Sarah gazed at the bride, she could see the woman's sorrowful expression, the same sorrow that had caused her to remain trapped in this hotel for so long. The bride had been abandoned, and her spirit had wandered for eternity, unable to let go of her unfinished business. But now she had found peace in seeing that someone was finally ready to help. Someone who would do what she could not, release the pain. Suddenly, Sarah felt a rush of emotions: anger, sadness, fear, and guilt. She had experienced a lifetime of loss just like the bride, but this moment, this final decision, was different. She understood now. Sometimes we hold on to things, memories, regrets, grief, because we think they define us. But in the end, it is only by letting go that we truly find peace. Mark, seeing Sarah's tear-streaked face, whispered, "It's okay. We'll be all right. We've been through the worst together, and if this is what it takes to set them free, then we'll do it." With a final shared tear, Sarah and Mark both closed their eyes. They made their choice. Together, they lifted their hands, offering their memories and their pasts to the spirits of the hotel. It was a painful moment of release, a moment of surrender. In an instant, the hotel trembled, and the spirits that had once haunted the walls and corridors now began to fade. The sound of the chains, the whispers, the cries, all ceased. The hotel groaned as if it were coming to life, its foundation shifting, and the long-forgotten curse was lifted. But as Sarah and Mark opened their eyes, they were no longer in the hotel. They stood on the threshold, gazing at the now empty lobby. The chandelier above was no longer swinging, and the air was fresh and crisp. There were no more ghosts, no more voices. The hotel was now just a building, quiet, still, and free from the torment of the past. They stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. The world was different now, and so were they. They had learned a painful but important lesson. Letting go doesn't mean losing everything. Sometimes it's the only way to truly move forward. The Graycrest Hotel was no longer a place of horror. It had transformed into a memory, a lesson, reminding all who heard its story of the power of release and the courage it takes to move on. And as Sarah and Mark walked into the night, they knew one thing for certain. Some ghosts were not meant to be feared. They were meant to be understood. The moral of this chilling tale is simple. Sometimes, in order to escape the past, we must let go of the things that bind us to it. Whether it's the pain, the memories, or the fear, holding on too tightly can keep us trapped. Only by releasing these burdens can we find freedom and, sometimes, a miracle.